Britain's asylum hotel crisis. The Epping judgment sparks nationwide unrest. If you want to understand exactly how Britain's immigration crisis is about to explode across our towns and cities, then you absolutely need to subscribe to UK Connors right now. Because what I'm about to tell you will fundamentally change how you view this government's approach to asylum policy and community relations. 3 senior judges have just handed Yvette the keys to override local democracy, and the streets are already burning with rage. Friday's Court of Appeal ruling didn't just overturn a High Court decision. It declared war on every community that dares to question where asylum seekers are housed. Lord Justice Bean, sitting alongside Lady Justice Nicola Davies and Lord Justice Cobb, has essentially told the people of Epping, Hanley, and dozens of other towns that their voices don't matter when the Home Office decides their neighborhoods need to accommodate 138 asylum seekers, whether they like it or not. But here's what the mainstream media won't tell you about this supposedly straightforward legal victory. When the judges ruled that Mr. Justice Eyre was erroneous for not involving the Home Office in the Bell Hotel decision, they weren't just correcting procedural oversight. They were fundamentally redefining the relationship between central government power and local community consent. The constitutional role relating to public safety that Lord Justice Bean referenced, that's code for we'll decide what's safe for your community, not you. The scenes outside the Bell Hotel on Friday night should terrify anyone who understands where the trajectory leads. 3 arrests, crowds of furious locals, and Richard Brace, a 60-year-old lifelong Essex resident who spends his time caring for a family member, promising that civil unrest is inevitable. "I've got a feeling this is the way we're heading," he told reporters, and frankly, when you see a community carer predicting violence, you'd better start paying attention because these aren't your typical political agitators. If you're not subscribed yet, hit that button now because the story is about to get much darker, and you won't want to miss how deep this rabbit hole goes. Carmen Pink Shirt reading "The Only Way is Epping. Send them home" might seem provocative, but a comment about schools returning next week reveals a genuine terror parents are experiencing. "The youngsters will be going about in the back, which is not a good thing," she said. And that's not racism talking. That's a mother watching her community transform in ways she never consented to and feeling completely powerless to protect her children from consequences. Now let's talk about what Matt would say to the Hanley protest, because his words expose a sophisticated political understanding that establishment politicians are desperately trying to dismiss as simple bigotry. "We're not racist. We just love our kids." They're yelling racism at us, but we're not racist. We need to comprehend the demographic challenges from a statistical and logical standpoint. Whether you agree with his conclusions or not, that's not the language of a mindless extremist. That's someone who's done his homework and reached uncomfortable conclusions that polite society refuses to acknowledge. The counter-protests in Hanley tell their own story about how polarized this has become. 60 protesters facing off against 20 demonstrators outside the Best Western Plus, waving signs reading "Stop the Far Right" and "Refugees are welcome here," while one protester expressed concern for the women and the children and all of our veterans being left on the streets. Both sides believe they are defending something sacred, but only one side is being told their concerns are legitimate. Here's where this gets properly sinister from a constitutional perspective. So make sure you're subscribed because these are the details that will matter when historians write about how British democracy died. Lord Justice Bean's reasoning that the judge's approach ignores the obvious consequence that the closure of one site means capacity needs to be identified elsewhere in the system reveals exactly how our political class views local communities, as interchangeable units in a bureaucratic spreadsheet rather than living, breathing places with their own character and concerns. The Home Office's victory in the Court of Appeal isn't just about housing 138 asylum seekers in a hotel in Essex. It's about establishing the precedent that central government can override any local objection to immigration policy by invoking public safety concerns. When unelected judges start telling elected local representatives that constitutional obligations trump democratic accountability, you're witnessing the transformation of Britain from a democracy into something else entirely. Police forces across the United Kingdom preparing for weekend demonstrations aren't just responding to isolated local grievances. They're recognizing a pattern of organized resistance that's spreading faster than anyone in Westminster wants to admit. When law enforcement agencies explicitly prepare for civil unrest, they are not dealing with spontaneous community complaints. They're managing the early stages of systematic political breakdown. Richard Brace has promised to be outside the Bell Hotel every Thursday and Sunday, as well as any day in between isn't just about one hotel in one town. It's about establishing a new form of sustained civil disobedience that could define British politics for the next decade. When a 60-year-old community carer becomes a protest leader promising ongoing resistance, you're looking at the kind of grassroots political mobilization that topples governments. Subscribe now if you haven't already, because what I'm about to explain will change how you understand everything that's happening in British politics right now. The comment about wars backed by the US, the UK, and NATO creating refugee flows while local communities bear the integration costs reveals something crucial that establishment politicians desperately want to avoid discussing. These protesters understand perfectly well that global foreign policy decisions create local immigration pressures, and they are asking why their neighborhood should pay the price for conflicts they never supported. That's not xenophobia. That's a sophisticated critique of how imperial foreign policy creates domestic political chaos. Carmen's devastation at Friday's verdict. It's amazing, it's as if they won, captures something profound about how these communities view the relationship between legal victory and political legitimacy. The Court of Appeal might have ruled in favor of the Home Office, but nobody in Epping feels like justice was served. When legal processes consistently produce outcomes that contradict community sentiment, those legal processes start losing their authority to maintain social order. The generational element Carmen highlighted about children walking past protests to reach school creates exactly the kind of emotionally charged imagery that transforms abstract policy debates into visceral political conflicts. Parents watching their children navigate adult political tensions they shouldn't have to understand while feeling powerless to influence the policies creating those tensions. That's a recipe for sustained political radicalization that crosses traditional party boundaries. What makes this weekend's demonstrations particularly significant is the timing. Schools returning, families already dealing with cost-of-living pressures, and communities watching their tax-funded resources stretch to accommodate asylum seekers while veterans sleep on the streets. It's a perfect storm of legitimate grievances that the establishment seems determined to dismiss rather than address. Make sure you're subscribed because the analysis I'm about to provide will be essential for understanding how this crisis develops over the coming months. The protester in Hanley who expressed concern for the women and the children and all of our veterans being left on the streets touched on something that reveals a fundamental dishonesty of how this debate is being framed. These communities aren't asking for asylum seekers to be deported or mistreated. They're asking why limited resources are being allocated in ways that pit vulnerable groups against each other rather than addressing underlying systemic failures. Yvette Cooper's victory in the Court of Appeal might look like effective governance, but it's actually revealed the weakness of the current approach. When you need 3 senior judges to override local democratic objections, when police forces nationwide are bracing for weekend violence, and when lifelong community members are promising sustained civil disobedience, you haven't solved a problem. You've simply chosen which version of chaos you prefer to manage. The broader pattern here is what should truly concern anyone who cares about British democracy. These hotel protests aren't happening in isolation. They are part of a wider phenomenon of communities feeling that immigration policy is something done to them rather than developed with them. When democratic processes consistently fail to incorporate legitimate local concerns, alternative forms of political expression inevitably emerge to fill that vacuum. Lord Justice Bean's logic about system-wide capacity management being more important than local consent establishes a precedent that could be applied to virtually any government policy that encounters community resistance. If constitutional obligations relating to public safety can override local democratic objections to asylum hotels, what's to stop the same reasoning being used to override objections to housing developments, infrastructure projects, or any other central government priority that encounters local opposition? The 3 arrests outside the Bell Hotel on Friday night weren't the end of something. They were the beginning of a much larger confrontation between communities that feel unheard in a political system that decided their voices don't matter. When Richard Brace predicts civil unrest and Carmen warns about community breakdown, they are not making threats. They're making observations based on their assessment of how their neighbors are likely to respond to feeling systematically ignored. If you're not already subscribed, you need to be, because what happens in the next few weeks will determine whether Britain can find a democratic solution to these tensions or whether we're heading towards something much darker. The asylum seekers themselves remain largely invisible in these debates, reduced to numbers in legal arguments, while real people navigate genuine trauma and uncertainty. But that invisibility is itself part of the problem. When policy is discussed in abstract terms rather than human realities, it becomes much easier for all sides to demonize each other rather than seeking genuine solutions that acknowledge everyone's legitimate concerns. What's particularly striking is how both sides of these protests share underlying concerns about social cohesion and community resources while reaching completely different conclusions about solutions. The protester who said all people want is a decent place to live, and I believe that both sides are correct in this, captured something important about the genuine dilemmas involved that our political class seems determined to ignore. This weekend's demonstrations will test whether Britain's establishment has learned anything from similar confrontations across Europe, where communities feeling abandoned by traditional political processes have turned to increasingly radical alternatives. When democratic channels feel inadequate to address genuine local concerns, street politics tends to fill a vacuum, and once that dynamic begins, it becomes very difficult to reverse. The Court of Appeal's ruling has guaranteed that these confrontations will continue, probably escalate, and definitely spread to other communities facing similar situations. The judges thought they were settling a legal question, but they've actually accelerated a political crisis that's been building for years across working-class communities that feel their voices don't count in modern Britain. What happens next depends largely on whether political leaders recognize that Friday's legal victory might prove to be a catastrophic political defeat. When communities like Epping and Hanley promise sustained resistance, they are not making idle threats. They are describing what happens when democratic processes consistently fail to incorporate legitimate local concerns into policy decisions. The police preparation suggests that law enforcement officials understand the seriousness of this moment better than some politicians might prefer. When you're dealing with sustained community resistance rather than isolated incidents, traditional public order strategies become less effective and political solutions become more urgent. The question is whether Britain's political class has the courage to engage with difficult conversations about immigration, integration, and community resources before street confrontations become the primary venue for these debates. So there you have it. The Court of Appeal thought it was resolving an administrative dispute about hotel accommodation, but it's actually declared open season on local democracy and community consent. This weekend's protests won't settle anything, but they'll certainly demonstrate just how deep these divisions run and how little trust remains between ordinary people and the institutions claiming to represent them. The real test isn't whether these demonstrations can be policed effectively. It's whether Britain's political system can evolve quickly enough to address the underlying issues before they explode into something none of us want to witness. And based on everything we've seen so far, that's looking increasingly unlikely. If you want to stay ahead of how this crisis develops, you absolutely must subscribe to UK Connors right now, because this story is nowhere near finished and the next chapter promises to be even more explosive than what we've witnessed so far. British politics just became a whole lot more dangerous, and you won't want to miss what happens next.